The decimation of the soldiers was not greatly liked, and when news came that the Lord Deputy had used the powers specially given him by the Queen to make no fewer than 59 knights, there was much laughter and shrugging of shoulders. But elsewhere the feeling was different. The people of London still had high hopes for their favourite, hopes which were voiced by Shakespeare in a play which he produced at this moment at the Globe Theatre. Southampton was the friend and patron of the rising dramatist, who took this opportunity of making a graceful public allusion to Southampton's own patron and friend. "How London doth pour out her citizens!" So spoke the chorus in Henry V, describing the victorious return of the king from France. "As, by a lower but by loving likelihood, were now the general of our gracious Empress, as in good time he may, from Ireland coming, bringing rebellion broached on his sword, how many would the peaceful city quit to welcome him?" The passage was no doubt applauded, and yet it is possible to perceive even here, through the swelling optimism of the lines, a trace or two of uneasiness. Elizabeth, waiting anxiously for a dispatch announcing Tyrone's defeat, and receiving instead nothing but letter after letter of angry complaints and despairing ejaculations, began to grow impatient. She did not restrain her comments to those about her. She liked nothing, she said, that was done in Ireland. "I give the Lord Deputy £1,000 a day to go on progress," she wrote to him, complaining bitterly of the delay and ordering him to march forthwith into Ulster. The reply came that the army was fatally depleted, that only 4,000 men were left of the 16,000 that had gone from England. She sent a reinforcement of 2,000, but the expense cut her to the quick. What was the meaning of this waste and this procrastination? Sinister thoughts came floating back into her head. Why, for instance, had he made so many knights? She wrote, peremptorily ordering Essex to attack Tyrone and not to leave Ireland till he had done so. "After you shall have certified us to what form you have reduced things in the north, you shall with all speed receive our warrant, without which we do charge you, as you tender our pleasure, that you adventure not to come out of that kingdom by virtue of any former license whatever." Her agitation deepened. One day at Nonsuch she met Francis Bacon and drew him aside. She knew him as a clever man, a friend of Essex, and possibly she could extract something from him which would throw a light on the situation. What was his opinion, she asked, of the state of affairs in Ireland, and, she flashed a searching glance upon him, the proceedings of the Lord Deputy? It was an exciting moment for Bacon. The honour was great and unexpected. He felt himself swept upward. With no official standing whatever, he was being consulted in this highly confidential way. What was he to answer? He knew all the gossip, and had reason to believe that, in the Queen's opinion, Essex was acting in a manner that was not only unfortunate and without judgment, but contemptuous and not without some private end of his own. With this knowledge, he made a reply that was remarkable. "Madam," he said, "if you had my Lord Essex here with a white staff in his hand, as my Lord of Leicester had, and continued him still about you for society to yourself, and for an honour and ornament to your attendants and court in the eyes of your people, and in the eyes of foreign ambassadors, then were he in his right element. For to discontent him as you do, and yet to put arms and power into his hands, may be a kind of temptation to make him prove cumbersome and unruly. And therefore, if you would send for him, and satisfy him with honour here near you, if your affairs, which I am not acquainted with, will permit it, I think were the best way." She thanked him, and passed onwards. So that was how the land lay. Arms and power, temptation, cumbersome and unruly. He had blown upon her smouldering suspicions, and now they were red hot. Shortly afterwards Henry Cuff arrived from Ireland with letters and messages for the Queen from the Lord Deputy. The tale he had to tell was by no means reassuring. The army, weakened still further by disease and desertion, was in an unsatisfactory condition. The bad weather made movement difficult, and the Dublin Council had once more pronounced strongly against an attack upon Ulster. Elizabeth wrote a scathing letter to her right trusty and well-beloved cousin, in which she no longer gave command, but merely desired to be informed what he was going to do next. She could not imagine, she said, what could be the explanation of his conduct. Why had nothing been done? If sickness of the army be the reason, why was not the action undertaken when the army was in better state? If winters approach, why were the summer months of July and August lost? If the spring were too soon, and the summer that followed otherwise spent, and the harvest that succeeded were so neglected as nothing hath been done, then surely we must conclude that none of the 4 quarters of the year will be in season for you and that council to agree to Tyrone's prosecution, for which all our charge is intended. Then, into the middle of her long and bitter argumentation, she stuck a phrase well calculated to give a jar to her correspondent. We require you to consider whether we have not great cause to think that your purpose is not to end the war. She was determined to make him realize that she was watching him carefully and was prepared for any eventuality. Meanwhile, in Dublin, the moment of final decision was swiftly approaching. The horns of a fearful dilemma were closing in upon the unfortunate Lord Deputy. Was he to obey the Queen and risk all against his own judgment and the advice of his council, or was he to disobey her and confess himself a failure? Winter was at hand, and if he were going to fight, he must fight at once. Hysterical and distracted, he was still hesitating when letters were brought to him from England. They told him that Robert Cecil had been appointed to the lucrative office which he himself had hoped to receive, of the mastership of the wards. Then every other feeling was drowned in rage. He rushed to Blount and Southampton. He had made up his mind, he said. He would not go into Ulster. He would go into England at the head of his army. He would assert his power. He would remove Cecil and his partners, and he would make sure that henceforward the Queen should act as she ought to act and as he wished. The desperate words were spoken, but that was all. The hectic vision faded, and before the consultation was over, calmer counsels had prevailed. Sir Christopher pointed out that what the Earl was proposing, to lead his small army with such a purpose from Wales to London, meant civil war. It would be wiser, he said, to go over with a bodyguard of a few hundred tried followers and effect a coup d'état at Nonsuch. But this plan, too, was waved aside. Suddenly veering, Essex decided to carry out the Queen's instructions and to attack Tyrone in Ulster. As a preliminary, he ordered Sir Conyers Clifford, at the head of a picked force, to effect a diversion by marching against the rebels from Connaught. He himself was preparing to move when there was a new catastrophe. Clifford, caught by the enemy on a causeway crossing a bog, was set upon, defeated, and killed. But it was too late for Essex to draw back, and at the end of August he left Dublin. At the same time he composed and dispatched a short letter to the Queen. Never were his words more gorgeous and his rhythms more moving. Never were the notes of anguish, remonstrance, and devotion so romantically blended together. From a mind delighting in sorrow, from spirits wasted with travail, care, and grief, from a heart torn in pieces with passion, from a man that hates himself and all things that keep him alive, what service can your Majesty reap? Since my services past deserve no more than banishment and proscription into the most cursed of all countries, with what expectation and what end shall I live longer? No, no, the rebels' pride and successes must give me no means to ransom myself. my soul, I mean, out of this hateful prison of my body. And if it happens so, your Majesty may believe that you shall not have cause to mislike the fashion of my death, though the course of my life may not please you. From your Majesty's exiled servant, Essex. It was very fine, thrilling, adorable, but the sequel was less so. If the desperate knight had indeed flung himself to death amid the arrows of the barbarians, but what happened was altogether different. In a few days he was in touch with Tyrone's army, which, though it outnumbered his own, refused to give battle. There was some manoeuvring, a skirmish, and then Tyrone sent a messenger demanding a parley. Essex agreed. The two men met alone, on horseback, at a ford in a river while the armies watched from either bank. Tyrone, repeating his old tactics, offered terms, but only verbally. He preferred, he said, not to commit them to writing. He proposed a truce, to be concluded for 6 weeks, to continue by periods of 6 weeks until May Day, and not to be broken without a fortnight's warning. Essex again agreed. All was over. The campaign was at an end. Of all the possible conclusions, this surely was the most impotent that could have been imagined. The grand expedition, the noble general, efforts, hopes, vaunting, it had all dwindled down at last to a futile humiliation, an indefinite suspension of hostilities, the equivocal, accustomed triumph of Tyrone. Essex had played all his cards now, played them as badly as possible, and there was nothing left in his hand. Inevitably, as the misery of his achievement sank into his consciousness, the mood of desperate resolutions returned. He decided that there was only one thing now that could save the situation. He must see the Queen. But, such was the wild wavering of his spirit, whether he was to come into her presence as a suppliant or a master he could not tell. He only knew that he could bear to be in Ireland no longer. With Blount's suggestion of a coup d'etat indeterminately hovering in his mind, he summoned round him the members of his household, and accompanied by them and a great number of officers and gentlemen, embarked at Dublin on September the 24th. Early on the morning of the 28th, the troop was galloping into London. The court was still at Nonsuch in Surrey, about 10 miles southward. The river lay between, and if an attack were to be made, it would be necessary for the cavalcade to ride through the city and cross the Thames at London Bridge. But by this time the notion of deliberate violence had become an unreality, had given place to the one overmastering desire to be with the Queen at the earliest possible moment. The quickest way was to take the ferry from Westminster to Lambeth, and Essex, leaving the bulk of his followers to disperse themselves in London, had himself rowed across the river with 6 of his chosen friends. At Lambeth, the weary men seized what horses they could find and rode on. They were soon passed by Lord Grey of Wilton, a member of the Cecil party, who, on a fresher mount, was also riding to court that morning. Sir Thomas Gerard spurred after him. "My lord, I beg you will speak with the Earl." "No," was Lord Grey's reply. "I have business at court." "Then I pray you," said Sir Thomas, "let my Lord of Essex ride before, that he may bring the first news of his return himself." "Doth he desire it?" said Lord Grey. "No," said Sir Thomas, "nor, I think, will desire anything at your hands." "Then I have business," said Lord Grey, and rode on with greater speed than ever. When Gerard told his friends what had occurred, Sir Christopher St. Lawrence cried out with an oath that he would press on and kill Lord Grey, and after him the secretary. The possibility of a swift, dramatic, irretrievable solution hovered in the air for a moment amid the group of angry gentlemen, but Essex forbade it. It would be mere assassination. He must take his chance. Directly Lord Grey reached Nonsuch, he went to Cecil and told him the astounding news. The secretary was calm, He did nothing, sent no word to the Queen, who was dressing in her upper chamber, but waited quietly in his chair. A quarter of an hour later, it was 10 o'clock, and the Earl was at the gate. He hurried forward without a second's hesitation. He ran up the stairs, and so, oh, he knew the way well enough, into the presence chamber, and thence into the privy chamber. The Queen's bedroom lay beyond. He was muddy and disordered from his long journey, in rough clothes and riding boots, but he was utterly unaware of any of that as he burst open the door in front of him. And there, quite close to him, was Elizabeth among her ladies, in a dressing-gown, unpainted, without her wig, her grey hair hanging in wisps about her face, and her eyes starting from her head. 13. She was surprised, she was delighted, those were her immediate reactions, but then, swiftly, a third feeling came upon her. She was afraid. What was the meaning of this unannounced, this forbidden return, and this extraordinary interruption? What kind of following had the man brought from Ireland, and where was it? What had happened? Was it possible that at this very moment she was in his power? Completely in the dark, she at once sought refuge in the dissimulation which was her second nature. Her instinctive pleasure in his presence, her genuine admiration of his manner and his speech, served her purpose excellently, and covered with smiles she listened while he poured out his protestations and told his story, listened with an inward accompaniment of lightening calculations and weighings of shifting possibilities and snatchings at dubious hints. Very soon she guessed that she was in no immediate danger. She laughingly bade him begone and change his clothes while she finished her toilette. He obeyed, returned, and the conversation continued for an hour and a half. He came downstairs to dinner in high spirits, flirted with the ladies, and thanked God that after so many storms abroad he had found so sweet a calm at home. But the calm was of short continuance. He saw the Queen again after dinner, and found the breezes blowing. She had made her inquiries, and, having sufficiently gauged the situation, had decided on her course of action. She began by asking disagreeable questions, disagreeably. When he answered, she grew angry. Finally, she declared that he must explain himself to the council. The council met, and when the Earl had given an account of his proceedings, adjourned in vague politeness. Perhaps all was well. It almost seemed so. But the Queen, apparently, was still vexed and inaccessible. At 11 o'clock at night the Earl received a message from Her Majesty. He was commanded to keep to his chamber. Everyone was mystified, and the wildest speculations flew about. At the first blush it was supposed that Essex had completely triumphed, that in one bold stroke he had recaptured the favour and the power that were slipping from his grasp. Bacon sent off a letter of congratulation. "I am more yours than any man's, and more yours than any man," he wrote. A little later, the news of the Queen's displeasure brought doubts, yet it seemed hardly possible that anything very serious should happen to the Earl, who, after all, had only been blundering in Ireland like so many before him. But meanwhile the Queen proceeded with her plan. Having waited a day, during which no news came of any suspicious movements in London, she felt she could take her next step. She committed Essex to the custody of the Lord Keeper Egerton, to whose residence, York House, in the Strand, he was forthwith removed. All still remained calm, and Elizabeth was satisfied. Essex was now completely at her mercy. She could decide at her leisure what she would do with him. While she was considering, he fell ill. He had been seriously unwell before he left Ireland, and the fatigue of his 3 days' ride across England, followed by the emotion and disgrace at Nonsuch, had proved too much for his uncertain and suggestible physique. Yet while he lay in captivity at York House, he still, though crying out from time to time that he only longed for a country obscurity, had not given up hopes of a return to favour and even a reinstatement as Lord Deputy. He wrote submissive letters to the Queen, but she refused to receive them and sent no word. John Harrington, who had been among those he had knighted in Ireland, returned at this moment, and Essex begged him to be the bearer of yet another missive, filled with contrition and adoration. But the sprightly knight preferred to take no risks. He had been threatened with arrest on his arrival in London, and he felt that his own affairs were as much as he could manage. Charity, he said, began at home, and he had no desire to be racked on the Essex coast. His conscience, too, was not quite clear. He had had the curiosity to pay a visit to Tyrone after the pacification, and had behaved, perhaps, in too friendly and familiar a fashion with the recreant Earl. He had produced a copy of his Ariosto, had read aloud some favourite passages, had presented the book to the elder of Tyrone's sons, two children of good, towardly spirit, in English clothes like a nobleman's sons, with velvet jerkins and gold lace, and finally had sat down to a merry dinner with the rebels at a fern table spread under the stately canopy of heaven. Possibly some rumour of these proceedings had reached Elizabeth's ears, and she was not altogether pleased by them. Nevertheless, he believed that all would be well if only he could obtain an audience. He knew that she had a liking for him. He was her godson, had been familiar with her from his childhood, and was actually connected in an underground way with the royal family, his stepmother having been a natural daughter of Henry VIII. At last he was told that the Queen would receive him. He went to court in considerable trepidation, and as soon as he entered the presence, he thanked his stars that he had had the sense to refuse to deliver any message from Essex. He never forgot the fearful scene that followed. Hardly had he knelt before her than she strode towards him, seized him by the girdle, and shaking it, exclaimed, "By God's son, I am no queen! That man is above me. Who gave him command to come here so soon? I did send him on other business." While the terrified poet stammered out some kind of answer, she turned from him in fury, walked fastly to and fro, and looked with discomposure in her visage. "By God's son," she burst out again, "you are all idle knaves, and Essex worse." He tried to pacify her, but her colour did outrun all reason. She would listen to nothing, and in the storm of her invective seemed to forget that her unfortunate godson was not, after all, the Lord Deputy. At last, however, she grew calmer, asked questions, was amused by Harrington's little jokes and stories, and made no account of his hobnobbing with Tyrone. He described the rebel to her, and his curious court, how his guard for the most part were beardless boys without shirts, who in the frost wade as familiarly through rivers as water-spaniels. With what charm, he added, such a master makes them love him, I know not, for if he bid them come, they come. If go, they do go, and if he say do this, they do it. She smiled, and then, suddenly changing countenance, told him to go home. He did not stay to be bidden twice, but rode away to his house in Somersetshire, as if all the Irish rebels had been at his heels. The author of The Metamorphosis of Ajax was no fit confidant for a perplexed and injured sovereign. Elizabeth looked elsewhere for an adviser, or at any rate a listener, and she found what she wanted in Francis Bacon. Recalling the conversation of the summer, she took advantage of his official attendance upon her on legal business to revert to the subject of the Earl. She found his answers pertinent. She renewed the topic, and so began a series of strange dialogues in which, during many months, in confidential privacy, the fate of Essex, with all its hidden implications of policy and passion, became the meeting point of those two most peculiar minds. Elizabeth was, as usual, uncertain how to treat the situation in which she found herself. Was there to be forgiveness or punishment? And, if the latter, of what kind? Revealing little, she asked much. As for Bacon, he was in his element. He felt that he could thread his way through the intricacies that surrounded him with perfect propriety. To adjust the claims of personal indebtedness and public duty, to combine the feelings of the statesman and the friend, to hold the balance true between honour and ambition, other men might find such problems difficult, if not insoluble. But he was not frightened by them. His intellect was capable of more than that. As he talked to Elizabeth, he played upon the complex theme with the profound relish of a virtuoso. He had long since decided that in all human probability Essex was a ruined man. He owed the Earl something, much, but it would be futile to spoil his own chances of fortune by adhering to a hopeless cause. It was essential to win the good graces of Robert Cecil, and now there was his heaven-sent opportunity, which it would be madness to miss, for acquiring something more important still, the confidence of the Queen. Besides, he could doubt it no longer, Essex was a mischievous person whose activities were dangerous to the state. While he was clearly bound to give him what help he could as a private individual, he was certainly under no obligation to forward the return of such a man to power. It was even his duty to insinuate into the Queen's mind his own sense of the gravity of the situation. And so, with unhesitating subtlety, he spun the web of his sagacious thought. He had no doubt of himself, none, and when, a few years later, under the pressure of the public disapproval, he wrote an account of his proceedings, it still seemed to him that a recital of his actual conduct was all that was necessary as a justification. Elizabeth listened with interest to everything he had to say. It was always impossible to do otherwise. He was profuse in his expressions of sympathy and attachment to the Earl, but he needs must say it, there were some positions to which he thought him ill-suited. To send him back to Ireland, for instance. "Essex," interrupted the Queen, "whensoever I send Essex back into Ireland, I will marry you. Claim it of me." No, that was not her thought. Far from it. She intended rather to bring him to justice. But by what process? She inclined to a trial before the Star Chamber. But Bacon demurred. It would, he said, be a dangerous proceeding. It might be difficult to produce cogent proof in public of the Earl's delinquencies, and his popularity was so great that a severe punishment on insufficient evidence might produce most serious consequences. She glared angrily and dismissed him. She did not like that suggestion, but the words sank into her mind, and she veered away from the notion of a public prosecution. For, as time passed, everything now seemed to show that Bacon's warning was justified. There could be no doubt about the Earl's popularity. It was increased by his illness, and when it was whispered that he lay near to death in his captivity, the public indignation made itself heard. Pamphlets defending the Earl and attacking his enemies were secretly printed and scattered broadcast. At last, even the white walls of the palace were covered with abusive scrawls. Bacon was singled out for particular denunciation. He was a traitor who was poisoning the Queen's mind against his benefactor. He was threatened, so he declared, with assassination. This was unpleasant, but some use might be made of it. It might serve to put beyond a doubt his allegiance to the secretary. He wrote to his cousin, telling him of these threats of violence, against which, he said, "I thank God I have the privy coat of a good conscience." He looked upon them as a deep malice to your honourable self, upon whom, by me, through nearness, they think to make some aspersion. Cecil smiled gently when he read the letter, and he sent for his cousin. He wished to make his own position quite clear. He had indeed heard, he said, that Francis had been doing some ill office to Essex, but he did not believe it. And then he added, "For my part, I am merely passive and not active in this action, and I follow the Queen, and that heavily, and I lead her not. The Queen indeed is my sovereign, and I am her creature. I may not lease her, and the same course I wish you to take." So he explained himself, and the explanation was a perfectly true one. Robert Cecil was indeed merely passive, merely following, with the sadness which his experience of the world had brought him, the action of the Queen. But passivity, too, may be a kind of action, may, in fact, at moments prove more full of consequence than action itself. Only a still, disillusioned man could understand this. It was hidden from the hasty children of vigour and hope. It was hidden, among others, from Walter Raleigh. He could not conceive what the secretary was doing. He was letting a golden opportunity slip through his fingers. He was leaving the Queen to her own devices. It was madness. This was the time to strike. "I am not wise enough," he wrote to Cecil, "to give you advice. But if you take it for a good counsel to relent towards this tyrant, you will repent it when it shall be too late. His malice is fixed, and will not evaporate by any your mild courses, for he will ascribe the alteration to her Majesty's pusillanimity, and not to your good nature, knowing that you work but upon her humour, and not out of any love towards him. The less you make him, the less he shall be able to harm you and yours, and if her Majesty's favour fail him, he will again decline to a common person. Lose not your advantage. If you do, I read your destiny. Yours to the end, W.R." It was true. He was not wise enough to give a Cecil advice. Could he not see that the faintest movement, the slightest attempt to put pressure upon the Queen would be fatal? How little he understood that perverse, that labyrinthine character! No, if anything was to be done, she herself, in her own strange way and with her own strange will, must do it. And the secretary sat motionless, waiting, watching, and holding his breath. Elizabeth certainly needed watching very carefully. For the moment she seemed to be occupied with entirely frivolous pursuits. The ceremonies of Accession Day absorbed her, and she sat for hours in the tilt-yard, where Essex had so often shone in all his glory, careless and amused. And when at last there was a grotesque surprise, and Lord Compton came in, as an eyewitness described it, like a fisherman with 6 men clad in motley, his caparisons all of net, having caught a frog, the old creature's sides shook with delighted laughter. A week later she came to a sudden decision. She would justify her treatment of Essex before the world by having a statement of his delinquencies read out by the Council in the Star Chamber. He himself could not be present. He was too ill. But was he? She could not feel quite sure. He had been known before now to convert a fit of the sulks into a useful malady. She would see for herself. And so, at 4 o'clock in the evening of November the 28th, accompanied by Lady Warwick and Lord Worcester, she stepped into her barge and had herself conveyed to York House. We know no more. Essex was in truth very ill, apparently dying. Was he conscious of her visit? Were there words spoken? Or did she come and look and go unseen? Unanswerable questions. The November night falls, gathering her up into its darkness. Next day the Star Chamber met, and the statement of the Earl's misdoings was read aloud. It was declared that he had mismanaged the Irish operations, that he had made a disgraceful treaty with Tyrone, and that he had returned to England contrary to the Queen's express orders. Members of the public were admitted, but Francis Bacon did not attend. Elizabeth, running over the list of those who had been present, observed the fact. She sent him a message asking the meaning of it. He replied that he had thought it wiser to keep away in view of the threats of violence against his person, but she was not impressed by the excuse and did not speak to him again for several weeks. The Star Chamber declaration led to nothing. The weeks, the months flowed by, and Essex was still a prisoner. The fatal evening at Nonsuch proved to have been the beginning of a captivity which lasted almost a year. Nor was it a mild one. None of the Earl's intimates were allowed to see him. Even Lady Essex, who had just borne him a daughter, and who haunted the court dressed in the deep mourning of a suppliant, was forbidden to see her husband for many months. Elizabeth's anger had assumed a grimmer aspect than ever before. Was this still a lover's quarrel? If so, it was indeed a strange one, for now contempt, fear, and hatred had come to drop their venom into the deadly brew of disappointed passion. With fixed resentment, as the long months dragged out, she nursed her wrath. She would make him suffer for his incompetence, his insolence, his disobedience. Did he imagine that his charms were irresistible? She had had enough of them, and he would find that he had made a mistake. With the new year, it was the last of the century, there were two developments. Essex began to recover, and by the end of January he had regained his normal health. At the same time, the Queen made a new attempt to deal with the situation in Ireland. Tyrone had himself put an end to the truce of September and had recommenced his manoeuvrings against the English. Something had to be done, and Elizabeth, falling back on her previous choice, appointed Mountjoy Lord Deputy. He tried in vain to escape from the odious office, but it was useless. Elizabeth was determined, go he must. Before doing so, however, he held a consultation with Southampton and Sir Charles Davers, another devoted follower of Essex, as to how he might best assist the imprisoned Earl. An extraordinary proposal was made. For some years past, Essex had been in communication with James of Scotland, and Mountjoy himself, during the campaign in Ireland, had written to the king, whether with or without the knowledge of Essex is uncertain, asking him to make some move in Essex's behalf. James's answer having proved unsatisfactory, the matter was dropped, but it was now revived in an astonishing and far more definite manner. It was well known that the prime object of the King of Scotland's policy was to secure the inheritance of England. Mountjoy suggested that a message should be sent to James informing him that the Cecil party was hostile to his succession, that his one chance lay in the reinstatement of Essex, that if he would take action in Essex's favour, Mountjoy himself would cross over from Ireland with an army of 4,000 or 5,000 men, and that with their combined forces they could then impose their will upon the English government. Southampton and Davers approved of the project, and there can be no doubt that Essex himself gave his consent to it, for the conspirators had found means of conveying letters in secret to and from York House. The messenger was dispatched to Scotland, and Mountjoy actually started to take up the government of Ireland with this project of desperate treason in his mind. But James was a cautious person. His reply was vague and temporizing. Mountjoy was informed, and the scheme was allowed to drop. But not for long, for in the spring Southampton went to Ireland, and Essex took the opportunity to send a letter to Mountjoy, urging him to carry out his original intention and to lead his army into England, with or without the support of James. Mountjoy, however, had changed his mind. Ireland had had its effect on him, too, and an unexpected one. He was no longer the old Charles Blount, who had been content to follow in the footsteps of his dazzling friend. He had suddenly found his vocation. He was a follower no more. He was a commander. He felt that he could achieve what no one else had achieved before him. He would pacify Ireland. He would defeat Tyrone. Penelope herself would not keep him from that destiny. His answer was polite but firm. To satisfy my Lord of Essex' private ambition, he would not enter into an enterprise of that nature. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, unaware of these machinations, was wondering gloomily what she was going to do. The Tower? On the whole, she thought not. Things were bad, but not quite so bad as that. Nevertheless, she would move the culprit out of York House. The poor Lord Keeper could not be made a gaoler for ever, and Essex was sent into his own house, after Anthony Bacon and all his other friends had been turned out of it, to be kept there in as close confinement as before. Then her mind again moved towards the Star Chamber. She summoned Bacon, who once more advised against it. Once more he told her, not that the Earl's misdoings hardly deserved so terrible a form of prosecution, but that his power with the people was such as to make it dangerous. This time she agreed with him, and decided to set up a disciplinary tribunal of her own devising. There should be a fine show, and the miscreant should be lectured, very severely lectured, made to apologize, frightened a little, and then let off. So she arranged it, and everyone fell in with her plans. Never was the cool paternalism of the Tudors so curiously displayed. Essex was a naughty boy who had misbehaved, been sent to his room and fed on bread and water, and now he was to be brought downstairs, and after a good wigging told he was not to be flogged after all. The ceremony took place, June the 5th, 1600, at York House, and lasted for 11 hours without a break. Essex knelt at the foot of the table, round which the assembled lords of the council sat in all their gravity. After some time the Archbishop of Canterbury moved that the Earl be allowed to stand. This was granted. Later on he was allowed to lean, and at last to sit. The Crown lawyers rose one after another to denounce his offences, which, with a few additions, were those specified in the Star Chamber Declaration. Among the accusers was Bacon. He had written an ingenious letter, begging to be excused from taking a part in the proceedings, but adding that, if Her Majesty desired it, he could not refuse. Naturally enough, Her Majesty did desire it, and Bacon was instructed to draw the attention of the Lords to the Earl's impropriety in accepting the dedication of Heywood's History of Henry IV. He knew full well the futility of the charge, but he did as he was bid. All was going well, and Essex was ready with a profound apology, when the dignity of the scene was marred by the excited ill-humour of Edward Coke, the Attorney General. Essex found himself being attacked in such a way that he could not refrain from angry answers. Coke retorted, and the proceedings were degenerating into a wrangle when Cecil intervened with some tactful observations. Then the judgment of the court was given. Imprisonment in the Tower and an enormous fine were hung for a moment over the Earl's head, but on his reading aloud an abject avowal of his delinquencies, followed by a prayer for mercy, he was told that he might return to his house and there await the Queen's pleasure. He waited for a month before anything happened. At last his guards were removed, but he was still commanded to keep to his house. Not until the end of August was he given complete liberty. Elizabeth was relenting, but she was relenting as unpleasantly as possible. All through the summer she was in constant conference with Bacon, who had now taken up the role of intermediary between the Queen and the Earl. He had sent an apology to Essex for the part he had played at York House, and Essex had magnanimously accepted it. He now composed 2 elaborate letters, in Essex's name, addressed to the Queen and imploring her forgiveness. He did more. He invented a letter from his brother Anthony to Essex, and the Earl's reply, brilliant compositions in which the style of each was exquisitely imitated, and in which the Earl's devotion to his sovereign was beautifully displayed, and then he took these works and showed them to the Queen. Incidentally, There was much in them to the credit of Francis Bacon, but their effect was small. Perhaps Elizabeth was too familiar with the stratagems of plotters in the theatre to be altogether without suspicions when they were repeated in real life. Perhaps Elizabeth was too familiar with the stratagems of plotters in the theatre to be altogether without suspicions when they were repeated in real life. But Essex was not dependent upon Bacon's intervention. He wrote to the Queen himself again and again. In varying tones he expressed his grief, he besought for entire forgiveness, he begged to be allowed into the beloved presence once more. Now, having heard the voice of your Majesty's justice, I do humbly crave to hear your own proper and natural voice of grace, or else that your Majesty in mercy will send me into another world. I receive no grace, your Majesty shows no mercy. But if your Majesty will vouchsafe to let me once prostrate myself at your feet, and behold your fair and gracious eyes, though it be unknown to all the world, but to him that your Majesty shall appoint to bring me to that paradise, yea, though afterwards your Majesty punish me, imprison me, or pronounce the sentence of death against me, your Majesty is most merciful, and I shall be most happy. So he wrote, but it was not only to Elizabeth that he addressed himself. Even while he was pouring out these regrets and protestations, his mind kept reverting to Ireland. One day he sent for Sir Charles Davers and asked him to make yet one more attempt upon the fidelity of Mountjoy. Davers knew well enough how it would be, but he was absolutely devoted to the Earl, who, as he said afterwards, had saved my life, and that after a very noble fashion. He had suffered for me, and made me, by as many means, bound unto him, as one man could be bound unto another. The life he had saved, and my estate and means whatsoever he should ever dispose of. And the adoring vassal immediately took horse to do as his lord desired. A moment of crisis was approaching, which Essex perceived would reveal the real state of Elizabeth's mind. The monopoly of the sweet wines which she had granted him for 10 years would come to an end at Michaelmas. Would she renew it? It brought him a great income, and if she cut that off she would plunge him into poverty. Favour and hope, disgrace and ruin, those were the alternatives that seemed to hang upon her decision in this matter. She was well aware of it herself. She spoke of it to Bacon. "My Lord of Essex," she said, "has written me some very dutiful letters, and I have been moved by them. But," she laughed grimly, "what I took for the abundance of the heart I find to be only a suit for the farm of sweet wines." One letter, however, perhaps moved her more than the rest. "Haste, paper, to that happy presence whence only unhappy I am banished. Kiss that fair correcting hand which lays new plasters to my lighter hurts, but to my greatest wound applieth nothing. Say thou comest from pining, languishing, despairing Essex." Did she find those words impossible to resist? It may have been so. From some phrases in another letter we may guess that there was indeed a meeting, but if there was, it ended disastrously. In the midst of his impassioned speeches a fearful bitterness welled up within her. She commanded him from her presence, and with her own hands she thrust him out. Footnote. This is but one of the many letters which, since I saw your Majesty, I wrote but never sent unto you. I sometimes think of running, that is, in the tilt-yard, and then remember what it will be to come in armour triumphing into that presence, out of which both by your own voice I was commanded, and by your hands thrust out. Essex to the Queen, undated. She hesitated for a month, and then it was announced that the profits from the sweet wines would be henceforward reserved for the Crown. The effect upon Essex was appalling. He became like one possessed. Davers had already brought back word from Mountjoy that his decision was irreversible. He desireth my lord to have patience, to recover again by ordinary means the Queen's ordinary favour, that though he had it not in such measure as he had had heretofore, he should content himself. Patience, content himself, the time for such words was past. He raved in fury, and then, suddenly recoiling, cursed himself in despair. "He shifteth," wrote Harrington, who paid him at this time a brief and terrified visit, "from sorrow and repentance to rage and rebellion so suddenly as well proveth him devoid of good reason or right mind. He uttereth strange words, bordering on such strange designs that had me hasten forth and leave his presence. His speeches of the Queen becometh no man who hath mens sana in corpore sano. He hath ill advisers, and much evil hath sprung from this source. The Queen well knoweth how to humble the haughty spirit knoweth not how to yield, and the man's soul seemeth tossed to and fro like the waves of a troubled sea." His speeches of the Queen were indeed insane. On one occasion something was said in his presence of Her Majesty's conditions. "Her conditions!" he exclaimed. "Her conditions are as crooked as her carcass." The intolerable words reached Elizabeth, and she never recovered from them. She, too, perhaps, was also mad. Did she not see that she was drifting to utter disaster, that by giving him freedom and projecting him into poverty, by disgracing him and yet leaving him uncrushed, she was treating him in the most dangerous manner that could be devised? Her lifelong passion for half-measures, which had brought her all her glory, had now become a mania, and was about to prove her undoing. Involved in an extraordinary paralysis, she ignored her approaching fate. But the secretary ignored nothing. He saw what was happening and what was bound to follow. He knew all about the gatherings at Lord Southampton's in Drury House. He noted the new faces come up from the country, the unusual crowds of swaggering gentlemen in the neighbourhood of the Strand, the sense of stir and preparation in the air, and he held himself ready for the critical moment, whenever it might come. "14. For Essex had now indeed abandoned himself to desperate courses. Seeing no more of Anthony Bacon, he listened only to the suggestions of his mother and Penelope Rich, to the loud anger of Sir Christopher Blount, and to the ruthless counsel of Henry Cuff. Though Mountjoy had abandoned him, he still carried on a correspondence with the King of Scotland, and still hoped that from that direction deliverance might come. Early in the new year, 1601, he wrote to James asking him to send an envoy to London, who should concert with him upon a common course of action. And James, this time, agreed. He ordered the Earl of Mar to proceed to England while he sent Essex a letter of encouragement. The letter arrived before the ambassador, and Essex preserved it in a small black leather purse which he wore concealed about his neck. The final explosion quickly followed. The Earl's partisans were seething with enthusiasm, fear, and animosity. Wild rumours were afloat among them, which they disseminated through the city. The secretary, it was declared, was a friend to the Spaniards. He was actually intriguing for the Spanish Infanta to succeed to the crown of England. But more dangerous still was the odious Raleigh. Everyone knew that that man's ambition had no scruples, that he respected no law, either human or divine, and he had swore, so the story flew from mouth to mouth, to kill the Earl with his own hand if there was no other way of getting rid of him. But perhaps the Earl's enemies had so perverted the mind of the Queen that such violent measures were unnecessary. During the first week of February the rumour rose that he was to be at once committed to the Tower. Essex himself perhaps believed it. He took counsel with his intimates, and it seemed to them that it would be rash to wait any longer for the arrival of Mar. that the time had come to strike, before the power of initiative was removed from them. But what was to be done? Some favoured the plan of an attack upon the court, and a detailed scheme was drawn up by which control was to be secured over the person of the Queen with a minimum of violence. Others believed that the best plan would be to raise the city in the Earl's favour. With the city behind them, they could make certain of overawing the court. Essex could decide upon nothing. Still wildly wavering, it is conceivable that even now he would have indefinitely postponed both projects and relapsed into his accustomed state of hectic impotence if something had not happened to propel him into action. That something bears all the marks of the gentle genius of Cecil. With unerring instinct, the secretary saw that the moment had now arrived at which it would be well to bring matters to an issue, and accordingly he did so. It was the faintest possible touch. On the morning of Saturday, February the 7th, a messenger arrived from the Queen at Essex House, requiring the Earl to attend the council. That was enough. To the conspirators it seemed obvious that this was an attempt to seize upon the Earl, and that unless they acted immediately, all would be lost. Essex refused to move. He sent back a message that he was too ill to leave his bed. His friends crowded about him, and it was determined that the morrow should see the end of the secretary's reign. The Queen herself, who could be so base or so mad as to doubt it, was to remain inviolate. Essex constantly asserted it, and yet there were some, apparently, among that rash multitude, who looked even upon the divine Gloriana with eyes that were profane. There was a singular episode on that Saturday afternoon. Sir Gilly Merrick, one of the most fiery of the Earl's adherents, went across the river with a group of his friends to the players at Southwark. He was determined, he said, that the people should see that a sovereign of England could be deposed, and he asked the players to act that afternoon the play of Richard II. The players demurred. The play was an old one, and they would lose money by its performance, but Sir Gilly insisted. He offered them 40 shillings if they would do as he wished, and on those terms the play was acted. Surely a strange circumstance. Sir Gilly must have been more conversant with history than literature, for otherwise how could he be imagined that the spectacle of the pathetic ruin of Shakespeare's minor poet of a hero could have nerved any man on earth to lift a hand, in actual fact, against so oddly different a ruler? The government, aware of everything, took its precautions, and on Sunday morning the guards were doubled at Whitehall. Sir Charles Davis went there early to reconnoitre, and returned with the news that it was no longer possible to surprise the court. He recommended the Earl to escape secretly from London, to make his way into Wales, and there raise the standard of revolt. Sir Christopher Blount was for immediate action, and his words were strengthened by the ever-increasing crowd of armed men who, since daybreak, had been pouring into the courtyard of Essex House. 300 were collected there by 10 o'clock, and Essex was among them, and there was a knocking at the gate. The postern was opened, and 4 high dignitaries, the Lord Keeper, the Earl of Worcester, Sir William Knollys, and the Lord Chief Justice, made their appearance. Their servants were kept out, but they themselves were admitted. They had come, said Egerton, from the Queen, to inquire the cause of this assembly, and to say that if it arose through any grief against any persons whatsoever, all complaints should be heard and justice given. The noise and tumult were so great that the conversation was impossible, and Essex asked the stately but agitated envoys to come up with him to his library. They did so, but hardly had they reached the room when the crowd burst in after them. There were cries of "Kill them! Kill them!" and others of "Shop them up!" The Earl was surrounded by his shouting and gesticulating followers. He tried to speak, but they interrupted him. "Away, my lord! They abuse you, they betray you, they undo you, you lose time." He was powerless among them, and while the lords of the council vainly adjured them to lay down their arms and depart in peace, he found himself swept towards the door. He bade Egerton and the others stay where they were. He would return ere long, he cried out, and go with them to the Queen. Then he was out of the room, and the door was shut and locked on the councillors. They were shopped up. Down the stairs and into the courtyard streamed the frenzied mob. And then the great gates were opened, and they all rushed out into the street. But even now, at this last moment, there was hesitation. Where were they to go? "To the court, to the court," cried some, and all waited upon Essex. But he, with a sudden determination, turned towards the city. To the city, then, it was to be. But there were no horses for such a multitude. They must all walk. The Strand lay before them, and down the Strand they hurried, brandishing their weapons. In front of all strode the tall black figure of Sir Christopher Blount. "Saw! Saw! 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 Tray! Tray!" he shouted, seeking with wild gestures and incoherent exclamations to raise up London for the Earl. The insurgents entered the city by Ludgate, but the government had been beforehand with them. Word had been sent to the preachers to tell the citizens to keep themselves within their doors, armed until further orders, and the citizens obeyed. Why should they do otherwise? The Earl was their hero, but they were loyal subjects of the Queen. They were quite unprepared for this sudden outbreak. They could not understand the causes of it, and then the news reached them that the Earl had been proclaimed a traitor, and the awful word and the ghastly penalties it carried with it struck terror into their souls. By noon, Essex and his band were at St. Paul's, and there was no sign of any popular movement. He walked onward, crying aloud as he went that there was a plot to murder him, and that the crown had been sold to the Spanish Infanta, but it was useless. There was no response, not a creature joined him. Those who were in the street stood still and silent, while perplexed and frightened faces peeped out at him from doors and windows on either side. He had hoped to make a speech at Paul's Cross, but in such an atmosphere a set oration was clearly impossible, and besides, his self-confidence had now utterly gone. As he walked on down Cheapside, all men could see that he was in desperation. The sweat poured from his face, which was contorted in horror. He knew it at last. He was ruined. His whole life had crashed to pieces in this hideous fiasco. In Gracechurch Street he entered the house of one of his friends, Sheriff Smith, upon whose support he reckoned. But the sheriff, though sympathetic, was not disloyal, and he withdrew on the pretext of consulting the Lord Mayor. After refreshing himself a little, Essex emerged to find that many of his followers had slipped away, while the forces of the government were gathering against him. He determined to return to his house, but at Ludgate he found that the way was blocked. The Bishop of London and Sir John Levison had collected together some soldiers and well-disposed citizens, and had stretched some chains across the narrow entry. The rebels charged and were repelled. Sir Christopher was wounded. A page was killed, and some others were mortally injured. Essex turned down to the river. There he took a boat and rowed to Essex House, which he entered by the water-gate. The councillors, he found, had been set free and had returned to Whitehall. Having hurriedly destroyed a mass of incriminating papers, including the contents of the black leather purse about his neck, he proceeded to barricade the house. Very soon the Queen's troops, headed by the Lord Admiral, were upon him. Artillery was brought up, and it was clear that resistance was useless. After a brief parley, Essex surrendered at discretion and was immediately conveyed to the Tower. 15. The government had never been in any danger, though there must have been some anxious moments at Whitehall. It was conceivable that the city might respond to the Earl's incitement and that a violent struggle would be the consequence, but Elizabeth, who was never lacking in personal courage, awaited the event with vigorous composure. When the news came that all was well, and she knew that she could depend upon the loyalty of the people, she found herself without a qualm. She gave orders that Essex and his adherents should be put upon their trial immediately. Nearly 100 persons were in custody, and the council proceeded at once with the examination of the ringleaders. Very soon the whole course of the intrigues of the last 18 months, including the correspondence with James and the connivance of Mountjoy, had transpired. The trial of the 2 earls, Essex and Southampton, was fixed to take place before a special commission of peers on February the 18th. What line was the prosecution to take? It was speedily decided that no reference whatever should be made to Scotland, and that the facts incriminating Mountjoy, whose services in Ireland could not be dispensed with, should be suppressed. There would be ample evidence of treason without entering upon such delicate and embarrassing particulars. Bacon had been employed in the preliminary examination of some of the less important prisoners, and was now required to act as one of the counsel for the prosecution. He had no hesitations or doubts. Other minds might have been confused in such a circumstance, but he could discriminate with perfect clarity between the claims of the Earl and the claims of the law. Private friendship and private benefits were one thing. The public duty of taking the part required of him by the state in bringing to justice a dangerous criminal was another. It was not for him to sit in judgment. He would merely act as a lawyer, merely put the case for the Crown, to the best of his ability, before the peers. His own opinions, his own feelings were irrelevant. It was true, no doubt, that by joining in the proceedings he would reap considerable advantages. From the financial point of view alone, the affair would certainly be a godsend, for he was still pressingly in debt, and, besides that, there was the opportunity of still further ingratiating himself with the man who now, undoubtedly, was the most powerful personage in England, his cousin Robert Cecil. But was that an argument for declining to serve? It was nonsense to suppose so. Because a lawyer was paid his fee, did it follow that his motives were disreputable? There was, besides, one further complication. It was clear that it would be particularly useful for the government to number Francis Bacon among its active supporters. The Earl had been his patron, and was his brother's intimate friend, and if he was now ready to appear as one of the Earl's accusers, the effect upon the public, if not upon the judges, would be certainly great. It would be difficult to resist the conclusion that the case against Essex must be serious indeed, since Francis Bacon was taking a share in it. If, on the other hand, he refused, he would undoubtedly incur the Queen's displeasure and run the risk of actual punishment. It might mean the end of his career. What followed? Surely only a simpleton would be puzzled into hesitation. The responsibility for the government's acts lay with the government. It was not for him to inquire into its purposes, and if, by doing his duty, he avoided disaster, so much the better. Others might be unable to distinguish between incidental benefits and criminal inducements. For him it was all as clear as day. Never had his intellect functioned with a more satisfactory, a more beautiful precision. The argument was perfect. There was, in fact, only one mistake about it, and that was that it had ever been made. A simpleton might have done better, for a simpleton might have perceived instinctively the essentials of the situation. It was an occasion for the broad grasp of common humanity, not for the razor-blade of a subtle intelligence. Bacon could not see this. He could not see that the long friendship, the incessant kindness, the high generosity, and the touching admiration of the Earl had made a participation in his ruin a deplorable and disgraceful thing. Sir Charles Davers was not a clever man, but his absolute devotion to his benefactor still smells sweet among the withered corruptions of history. In Bacon's case, such reckless heroism was not demanded. Mere abstention would have been enough. If, braving the Queen's displeasure, he had withdrawn to Cambridge, cut down his extravagances, dismissed Jones, and devoted himself to those sciences which he so truly loved, but it was an impossibility. It was not in his nature or his destiny. The woolsack awaited him. Inspired with the ingenious grandeur of the serpent, he must deploy to the full the long luxury of his coils. One watches, fascinated, the glittering allurement. One desires in vain to turn away one's face. A state trial was little more than a dramatic formality. The verdict was determined beforehand by the administration, and everyone concerned was well aware that this was so. Such significance as the proceedings had were of a political nature. They enabled those in power to give a public expression of their case against the prisoner, to lay before the world the motives by which they wished it to be supposed that they were actuated. In the present case there was no doubt whatever of the technical guilt of the accused. The Court of Peers had consulted the judges, who had pronounced that the conduct of Essex and his followers on Sunday the 8th, whatever their intentions may have been, in itself constituted treason, so that sentence might have been passed immediately a formal proof of that conduct had been made. But that a walk through the city should involve such fearful consequences would outrage public feeling, and it was the object of the prosecution to show that Essex had been guilty of a dangerous and deliberate conspiracy. The fact that the most serious feature in the case, the intrigue with the King of Scotland, was to be suppressed was a handicap for the Crown lawyers, but their position was an extremely strong one. The accused were allowed no counsel. Their right of cross-examination was cut down to a minimum, and the evidence of the most important witnesses was given in the shape of depositions read aloud to the court, depositions which had been extracted in the Tower and which it was impossible to control or verify. On the whole, it seemed certain that with a little good management the prosecution would be able to blacken the conduct and character of the prisoners in a way which would carry conviction in every sense of the word. It so happened, however, that good management was precisely what was lacking on the part of the Crown leader, Edward Coke. On this far more serious occasion the Attorney-General repeated the tactical errors which he had committed at York House. He abused his antagonists so roughly as to raise sympathy on their behalf, and he allowed himself to be led away into heated disputations which obscured the true issues of the case. During these wranglings, Essex was more than once able to carry the war into the enemy's camp. He declared fiercely that Raleigh had intended to murder him, and Raleigh was put into the witness box to deny the irrelevant charge. A little later, Essex brought up the story that the succession had been sold to the Spaniards by the Secretary. There followed a remarkable and unexpected scene. Cecil, who had been listening to the proceedings from behind a curtain, suddenly stepped forth, and falling on his knees, begged to be allowed to clear himself of the slander. It was agreed that he should be heard, and after a long altercation with Essex, Cecil elicited the fact that the informant upon whose report the charge was based was Sir William Knollys, the Earl's uncle. Knollys in his turn was sent for, and his evidence exculpated the Secretary. All that had happened, he said, was that Cecil had once mentioned to him a book in which the Infanta's title was preferred before any other. Essex's accusations had collapsed, but the prosecution, after many hours, had come no nearer to a proof of his criminal intentions. It was useless for Coke to shout and hector. "It was your purpose," he cried, shaking a menacing finger at Essex, "to take not only the Tower of London, but the royal palace and the person of the prince, yea, and to take away her life." Such exaggerations were only damaging to his own cause. Bacon saw what was happening and judged that it was time to intervene. The real question at issue, the precise nature of the Earl's motives, was indeed a complicated and obscure one. The motives of the most ordinary mortal are never easy to disentangle, and Essex was far from ordinary. His mind was made up of extremes, and his temper was devoid of balance. He rushed from opposite to opposite. He allowed the strangest contradictories to take root together and grow up side by side in his heart. He loved and hated. He was a devoted servant and an angry rebel, all at once. For an impartial eye, it is impossible to trace in his conduct a determined intention of any kind. He was swept hither and thither by the gusts of his passions and the accidents of circumstance. He entertained treasonable thoughts, and at last treasonable projects, but fitfully, with intervals of romantic fidelity and noble remorse. His behaviour in Ireland was typical of all the rest. After suggesting an invasion of England at the head of his troops, he veered completely round and led his army against Tyrone. It finally turned out that he had gone too far to draw back, and pushed on by his own followers and the animosity of the Queen, he had plunged into a desperate action. But till the last moment he was uncertain, indefinite, and distraught. There was no settled malignancy in his nature. It is possible that he believed in the treachery of Cecil, and as it happened there was some justification for the belief, for Cecil, with all his loyalty, was actually in receipt of a Spanish pension. Convinced of his own high purposes, the unrealistic creature may well have dreamed in his sanguine hours that, after all, he would manage to effect a bloodless revolution, that Cecil and Raleigh could not be too roughly thrust upon one side, and that then the way would be open once more for his true affection, his true admiration, his true ambition, that henceforward the Queen would be his and he the Queen's, in glorious happiness, until death parted them. Such were his inward workings, and Francis Bacon was the last man in the world to have understood them. They were utterly remote from the clear, bright ambit of that supremely positive intelligence. Wish as he might, the author of the Essays or Counsels could never have comprehended a psychology that was dominated by emotion instead of reason. But on this occasion he did not wish. Sympathy was far from him. What were the actual facts? By facts alone was it possible to judge of conduct, and the court, led away by recrimination and irrelevancies, was beginning to lose sight of them. It was for him to brush aside, calmly but firmly, the excuses and the subterfuges of the prisoner, and to concentrate the attention of the judges and of the public on what was really the vital point in the whole business, the meaning of his deeds. With perfect tact, Bacon paid homage to the education of the peers by illustrating his remarks with an incident from the classics. All history, he said, made it plain that there was never any traitor heard of, but he always coloured his practices with some plausible pretence. Essex had made his colour the severing of some great men and counsellors from her Majesty's favour, and the fear he stood in of his pretended enemies, lest they should murder him in his house. Therefore, he saith, he was compelled to fly into the city for succour and assistance. He was not much unlike Pisistratus, of whom it was so anciently written, how he gashed and wounded himself, and in that sort ran crying into Athens that his life was sought, and like to have been taken away, thinking to have moved the people, and to have pitied him, and taken his part by such counterfeited harm and danger, whereas his aim and drift was to take the government of the city into his hands, and alter the form thereof. With like pretences of dangers and assaults, the Earl of Essex entered the city of London. In reality, he had no such enemies, no such dangers. The facts were plain. And, my lord, he turned to the prisoner, all whatsoever you have or can say in answer hereof are but shadows, and therefore methinks it were best for you to confess, not to justify. Essex could never distinguish very clearly between a personality and an argument. "I call forth Mr. Bacon," he replied, "against Mr. Bacon." And then he told the court how, but a few months previously, his accuser had written letters in his name to be shown to the Queen, in which his case had been stated, as orderly for me as I could do myself. "These digressions," said Bacon coldly, "are not fit, neither should be suffered." The letters were harmless, and, he added, "I have spent more time in vain in studying how to make the Earl a good servant to the Queen and State than I have done in anything else." Then he sat down, and the case came once more under the guidance of Coke. The confessions of the other conspirators were read, but there was no order in the proceedings. Point after point was taken up and dropped, and at last, when the Attorney General, after an harangue on the irreligion of the accused, offered to produce evidence upon the subject, the peers declined to hear it. Once more confusion had descended, and once more Bacon rose to fix attention upon the central issue. "I have never yet seen in any case such favour shown to any prisoner," he said. "So many digressions, such delivery of evidence by fractions, and so silly a defence of such great and notorious treasons." He then read aloud the opinion of the judges on the point of law, and continued, "To take secret counsel, to execute it, to run together in numbers armed with weapons, what can be the excuse? Warned by the Lord Keeper, by a herald, and yet persist. Will any simple man take this to be less than treason?" Essex interrupted. "If I had purposed anything against others than my private enemies," he said, "I would not have stirred with so slender a company." Bacon paused a moment, and then replied, addressing himself directly to the Earl, "It was not the company you carried with you, but the assistance which you hoped for in the city, which you trusted unto. The Duke of Guise thrust himself into the streets of Paris on the day of the barricadoes, in his doublet and hose, attended only with 8 gentlemen, and found help in the city, which, God be thanked, you failed of here. And what followed? The king was forced to put himself into a pilgrim's weeds, and in that disguise to steal away to escape their fury. Even such," he concluded, turning to the peers, "was my lord's confidence too, and his pretence the same, and all hail and kiss to the city. But the end was treason, as hath been sufficiently proved." The thrust was indeed a sharp one, but Bacon's words were no longer directed merely to the court and the public. The parallel with Guise, whose rebellion had occurred within living memory, had in it an actuality far more deadly than the learned allusion to Pisistratus. There could be only one purpose in drawing it. It was precisely calculated to touch, in the most susceptible place, the mind of the Queen. To put Essex before her with such verisimilitude, in the shape of the man who had raised up Paris against Henry III, was a masterstroke of detraction. The words, no doubt, would reach Elizabeth, but they were addressed in reality to someone else, to the invisible listener, who, after his dramatic appearance, had returned to his place behind the hangings. The secretary's kindred intellect appreciated to the full the subtle implications of the speech. His cousin was doing admirably. The Earl was silent. Francis Bacon's task was over. The double tongue had struck and struck again. Both prisoners were inevitably found guilty, and the revolting sentence was passed in the usual form. During the ordeal of the trial, Essex had been bold, dignified, and self-possessed. But now, back again in the tower, he was seized by a violent revulsion. Anguish and horror overpowered his mind. A Puritan clergyman, who had been sent to minister to him, took the opportunity to agitate his conscience and fill his imagination with the fear of hell. He completely collapsed. Self-reliance, self-respect were swept away in a flood of bitter lamentations. He wished, he said, to make a confession to the Lords of the Council. They came, and he declared to them that he was a miserable sinner, grovelling heartbroken before the judgment seat of God. He cried out upon his inexcusable guilt, and he did more. He denounced the black thoughts, the fatal counsels, the evil doings of his associates. They, too, were traitors and villains no less than himself. He raved against them all. His stepfather, Sir Charles Davers, Henry Cuff, each was worse than the other. They had lured him on to these abominable practices, and now they were all to sink together under a common doom. His sister, too, let her not be forgotten. She had been among the wickedest. Was she not guilty of more sins than one? "She must be looked to," he cried, "for she hath a proud spirit," adding dark words of Mountjoy and false friendship and broken vows of marriage. Then, while the grave councillors listened in embarrassed silence, he turned once more to his own enormities. "I know my sins," he said, "unto her Majesty and to my God. I must confess to you that I am the greatest, the most vilest and most unthankful traitor that has ever been in the land." While these painful scenes of weakness and humiliation were passing in the Tower, Elizabeth had withdrawn into deepest privacy at Whitehall. Every mind was turned towards her, in speculation, in hope, in terror. The fatal future lay now, spinning and quivering within her formidable grasp. It is not difficult to guess the steps by which she reached her final conclusion. The actual danger which she had run must have seemed to her, in spite of Bacon's reminder, the least important element in the case. The rising had been an act of folly, doomed from the first to ignominious failure, an act so weak and ineffective that, taken by itself, it could hardly be said to deserve the extreme penalty of the law. If, for other reasons, she was inclined towards mercy, there would be ample justification for taking a lenient view of what had happened, and for commuting the punishment of death for one, perhaps of imprisonment and sequestration. It is true that the intrigue with James of Scotland wore a more serious complexion, but this had proved abortive. It was unknown to all but a few in high places, and it might well be buried in oblivion. Were there, then, other reasons for mercy? Most assuredly there were, but these were not judicial reasons. Neither were they political. They were purely personal, and, of course, in that very fact lay their strength. To abolish, in a moment, the immediate miserable past, to be reconciled once more, to regain with a new rapture the old happiness, what was there to prevent it? Nothing, surely. She had the power for such an act. She could assert her will, extend her royal pardon. After a short eclipse he would be with her again. Not a voice would be raised against her. Cecil himself, she knew, would accept the situation without a murmur, and so would not all be well? It was indeed a heavenly vision, and she allowed herself to float deliciously down the stream of her desires, but not for long. She could not dwell indefinitely among imaginations. Her sense of fact crept forward, insidious, paramount. With relentless fingers it picked to pieces the rosy palaces of unreality. She was standing once again on the bleak rock.